Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I've just been issued a challenge by MoltenMinis. I think you better see this for yourself.
ED-SKaR, I summon upon you a challenge. You heard me correct. Here are the rules. First, get an old action figure you have. You can add parts or kit bash it with something and paint it. Now, last thing, do you accept my challenge?
And the only response that I can give to that is challenge accepted. And I think I have just the thing, because I have some of these Fortnite toys that fit the bill just right. I can probably pull some of the arms off of this, switch things around, make an interesting one, and then maybe make a scenic base for it. So, let's get started. Let's have a look at what I'm working with. And my first thought is to see about changing arms and heads over. I quickly found that they are made of this slightly soft material, probably vinyl, that just plugs in and can be pulled out just as easily. I looked at the poses to come up with a cool stance, but I also had to pay attention to the textures that would spoil the look, like the chainmail on this arm for example. I have no idea if there are specific skins or characters from the Fortnite games. I'm just mixing things up to make something that looks cool. I did play Fortnite once for all of 7 minutes, but I don't really get on with third-person games, so unfortunately not a game I can get into. Once I'd laid out my pieces and fixed them together, I gave the model a layer of primer and got straight into painting. And started with some base coats to give me an idea of what the model would end up looking like. I was immediately reminded of another toy that I painted recently, that being Madame Vastra in my Paint a Different Model Every Day for a Week video. Similar to that, this Fortnite toy has a lot less detail than the wargaming models that I usually paint. It's also a larger scale, at this time about 50mm tall. Now that's not a downside for painting. What it means is it gives me opportunities to paint in different ways and to use different techniques. The large smooth surfaces give me space to make blends, and the large details let me mark out cartoony shadows. But even as I put the base coats down, I was tempted straight into wet blending, which is a technique that I've been practicing a lot recently and enjoying thoroughly. However, this time I came a cropper with the highlighting of the blue trousers. My plan was to introduce some deliberate texture to hint at the material by laying my highlights out in regular lines. What I ended up with was very harsh highlights with strong edges and no fading at all. After a moment I realised that some of the shapes that I had made seemed similar to the fashionable camo patterns, as opposed to real-world camo patterns. So I leaned into that by mixing together a much brighter blue, which pretty much looks white, and dotting that around my intended highlights to create a coherent pattern, and hopefully bringing out that cartoony look. And this was interesting to me because recovering from a problem often requires better skills than performing the task perfectly in the first place. To be able to recognize an error, or a failed experiment in my case, and deal with that, to change track and end up with a success overall, now those are skills that I'd like practice at. Another aspect of this paint job that could be considered a mistake would be using a wash on the skin. Due to this model having far less moulded details, the facial features and the arm muscles particularly are much larger and rounder than on a 32mm model. And so the wash did not behave as desired. This was far easier for me to deal with, as it simply meant more work on highlights. I started my highlights with the same paint as I used for a base coat, essentially highlighting in my mid-tone, to recover the largest surfaces from the wash and leaving it only for the very lowest points. After 3 or 4 more highlight layers in increasingly smaller areas, the skin came out fairly well, I think. At least I'm not utterly dissatisfied with it. But with the model complete, I need to move on to the scenic base that I mentioned that I build. So I went through my various bags and boxes of utter junk that I refused to throw away and found some 3D print supports and rafts, as well as some industrial terrain that I had printed and never used. With a handful of the most useful pieces cherry-picked out, I set about trying to fit them together, which I think I achieved quite well. Painting was all of 3 steps. I painted it with terracotta paint, dry brushed it dark metallic, and then added a wash, which I may have put on a little heavily as this took overnight to dry. And that looked pretty good for the metalwork, but it was missing variety in colour. So I took advantage of the raft of these bases to make a grassed area, sort of, more of a lumpy green border, but it fit the job. This was simply baking powder and PVA glue mixed with extra water and some green paint. After this was dry, which took another day, I painted over the top with some more green just to really brighten it up. And that's the lot, all finished. Alright, we are all done, and I haven't glued half of this stuff down because I think it's kind of more interesting as a playset rather than as a diorama as such. But I think I have fulfilled the requirements of the challenge. Now, if you want to see MoltenMinis' take on the challenge, you should check the link in the description to his video, where he makes a very well-known orc character. And it is rather cool, so I suggest you check that out. There's also a little link in there for my regular viewers to maybe throw a few pennies my way, and for everyone else a comment section where you can post comments about what I have made, my little character, and the diorama or scenic base, depending on how you want to consider it. So that's all that. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.